in a little tent. Oh, and just like the river I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. It's been too hard living, but I'm afraid to die, 'cause I don't know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will.
Let him go!
Police abuse remains one of the most serious and divisive human rights violations in the United States today. The horrific images of Rodney King being beat by the LAPD and the execution of Oscar Grant by the BART police are some of the most blatant reminders of police brutality against innocent victims. The excessive use of force by police officers, including unjustified shootings, severe beatings, and fatal chokings, persist because overwhelming barriers to accountability make it possible for officers who commit human rights violations to escape due punishment and often to repeat their offenses. Police and public officials greet each new report of brutality with denials or explain that the act was just an aberration, while the administrative and criminal systems that should deter these abuses by holding officers accountable instead virtually grant them impunity. This special insider exclusive investigation discovered that police brutality is persistent and rampant across America, and that systems to deal with abuse have failed, and that victims seeking redress face daunting obstacles at every point in the process, ranging from overt intimidation to the reluctance of local and federal prosecutors to take on brutality cases of officers who have committed these human rights violations. Despite claims to the contrary from city officials where abuses have become scandals in the media, efforts to make meaningful reforms have fallen short. The barriers to accountability are remarkably similar from city to city. Shortcomings in recruitment, training, and management are common to all. So is the fact that officers who repeatedly commit human rights violations tend to be a small minority who taint entire police departments but are protected routinely by the silence of their fellow officers and by flawed systems of reporting, oversight, and accountability. Today, the Insider exclusive TV series examines this epidemic in this exclusive special, Police Brutality, the Execution of Oscar Grant, and how famed Oakland-based civil rights lawyer John Burris, founder and partner of the law offices of John Burris, is getting justice for the Oscar Grant family. You will see how John is presenting this case by exposing the lies and the contradictions of the various BART police officers. As John has often said, the problem of police brutality is much more widespread than most Americans are willing to admit. Our nation practices a selective blindness. In this great and strong nation, we have all become unwitting accomplices to the continuation of the conflict. John has earned the highest respect from citizens and lawyers alike as one of the best civil rights trial lawyers in Oakland, in California, and in the nation. He has seen many innocent and hardworking people become victims of police brutality. He understands that police brutality is one of the most serious, enduring, and divisive human rights violations in the United States. And the problem is not just in Oakland, but nationwide, and its nature is institutionalized. And because of that, he is driven to fight for people who have been harmed by the willful or negligent actions of others. He learned a long time ago that if a man hasn't discovered something he will die for, he isn't fit to live. His goals, not only to get justice for his clients, but to make sure all Americans have the right to a fair trial, honest cops, impartial prosecutors, and fair judges with no agendas. Because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and justice and power must be brought together so that whatever is just may be powerful, and whatever is powerful may be just. Hi, I'm Steve Murphy, and this is the Insider Exclusive, live from Oakland, California at the law offices of John Burris. It is my great privilege and pleasure to introduce John Burris to the show. Welcome to the show, John.
Good to be with you.
Tell our audience a little bit about what type of law you practice.
My practice is essentially a civil rights practice, emphasizing primarily police misconduct, as well as some employment discrimination as well, but mainly police misconduct. And those are situations where someone comes to me and they have been abused by the police in some fashion, whether it's physical assaults, wrongful death, or any assortment of things, jail suicides, jail killings, we have an array of police misconduct cases.
Right. We are showing a book that you wrote, which is Blue versus Black. You wrote that how many years ago?
I wrote that in 1999. It came about as a consequence of my involvement in the Rodney King case,
right.
Where at the time I really was trying to figure out why good people who go into the police departments turn out to engage in serious acts of brutality.
Right.
And so I wanted to look at that, and that caused me to look at police departments all around and
right.
look at some of the issues. And so I really wanted to see if there's some way to look at this issue and see if we can bridge the gap between the police and the community. So
right.
that's really what I had in mind, and it's been well received in both the police community as well as other communities.
And we're going to get into the Oscar Grant case here in a minute, but to be fair, there's a lot of good cops.
Oh, absolutely.
The problem is when they stand by each other and cover up the bad cops, isn't it?
I don't have a problem. There are many good police officers, many of whom I've known down through the years through various works. But you do have a situation of cops holding each other accountable.
Yes.
And the part that I have always seen is that good cops will stand by and cover or not say anything when they see that a bad cop is engaged in misconduct, and then that creates this kind of culture of cover-up, the code of silence, brotherhood kind of scenario that frequently allows for misconduct to occur.
Right.
The system gets perpetuated too because these officers who then have engaged in misconduct, who people have covered for them, they get promoted. And so the process continues on and on and on, and that's the challenge that we have when we're facing these police cases.
Today we're going to talk about a case that's been in the news for the last couple of years, and it's the case of the execution of Oscar Grant. Tell us who Oscar Grant was.
Oscar Grant at the time was a 22-year-old African-American young man. He grew up in Hayward, comes from a family, of extended family with mother, aunts, grandparents, you name it. He was a product of that. He'd had a few little scrapes with the law along the way, but fundamentally he was a kid who was really trying to put his life together. He had a young child. He and the mother of that child were living together. They were making plans to have their life together. And the tragic part about this, he was just on the precipice of getting it together, to making that kind of next step into adulthood. He was 22, and he was just about ready to make it. Everything about him, I read letters from teachers that he was the life of the party. He had great charisma, he had personality, and he was fundamentally and foremost a leader. And so that's the tragedy of this whole death of his.
Now tell us what happened on that fateful day, and as you're talking, we're going to show clips of videos that were done on people's cell phone. Tell us what happened.
Oscar and a group of his friends on New Year's Eve had gone to San Francisco, had taken Bart to celebrate. His mother had told him, Oscar, to take Bart that night. And so he says, okay, Mama.
In case he had been drinking.
Just in case, take Bart, you'll be safe. The irony of all that. So when they coming back, a dispute developed between Oscar and someone else on the Bart train. In the event, it stopped the train. Everyone got off, and as they were walking to the exit, a police officer, Anthony Peroni, comes up and immediately stops all of them with a taser. And Oscar and another friend got back on the train, but in the end, they came off largely at the physical aggressiveness of the part of this officer, Anthony Peroni. And from there, Anthony Peroni was overly aggressive toward many of the officers, overly aggressive toward many of the young men there. Ultimately, Measurely and a few other officers came to assist. And in the course of that, Officer Peroni said to them, that he wanted Oscar and another young man arrested. And when they did that, Meserly then goes on, attacks Mr. Grant, takes him to the ground. He's being held down by Officer Peroni and Meserly. And for whatever reasons, this doesn't make any sense, he ultimately pulls out his gun, steps back, and he shoots him in the back. Oscar was unarmed. The photos will show that both of his hands were behind his back at the time he was shot. So essentially what happened here is you have an execution. You have a young man who was shot in the back, who was unarmed, with 1 or 2 police officers who were on top of him holding him down. There was just no basis and no reason whatsoever to have a shooting of this kind.
You weren't involved with a criminal case, but bring our audience up to date. What happened to this officer?
The officer, after a lot of community support and aggravation around getting this officer prosecuted, because that really doesn't happen. Ultimately, he's prosecuted. He's charged with murder. Because of the high publicity, the case was transferred from Alameda County down to Los Angeles County.
Because of the riots, too.
Because there were rioting. People were outraged by this. This was a case where people were outraged because they had this video, and it was an unconscionable act. And so we ultimately got the DA to prosecute this case. It gets transferred to Los Angeles, and after a month worth of trial, a jury comes back and determined that Mr. Meserly was guilty of involuntary manslaughter, essentially saying he was negligent in the manner in which he pulled that weapon. This was a most offensive verdict that one can imagine, in large measure because Meserly, after the shooting took place, told everyone around that I thought he was going for a gun. I thought he was, and for several days, and he told none of his friends, none of the officers who were with him, not even his lawyer.
He didn't tell them right away then.
He did not tell them right away, and so we got no indication that this was his defense until the criminal trial. But he had made speeches, made talks with various people before that, and so we were offended. From my point of view, is that he was able to sell the jury on this particular defense, one of which he had not given before, and frankly was not corroborated by the evidence. But he was able to do it. It was a compromised verdict, in my view, on the part of the jury.
And this was called the weapon confusion defense.
Weapon confusion.
Where he confused a stun gun
with a revolver. He claims that he meant to pull his taser when he pulled, in fact, his firearm.
He had been a police officer for 2 years.
He had been a police officer well over for 2 to 4 years.
He wore a stun gun on one hip and the revolver on the other hip during the entire over 2 years. So he was well aware where the weapons were and which ones were there, right?
Well, they only had the weapon, the taser, for 1 month. They were trained on how to use it. Everyone was trained that you put the taser on the opposite side of your gun handle, so you have to do a cross draw. His weapon was on one side and his taser on the other side. More importantly, he had pulled that taser at least twice earlier that evening.
Now, he has been released from jail.
Yes.
There's still a Department of Justice investigation for violation of Oscar Grant's civil rights pending against him, isn't there?
Absolutely. After the verdict came in, I met with the congresswoman from our area, and we then sent a letter to the Department of Justice requesting that they investigate not only Officer Meserly, but Officer Peroni as well, because we thought he was the perpetrator and the cause of all of this. And so for purposes of determining whether civil rights were violated, and civil rights is different from that of, say, state court rights where you can assault someone. They're just a total difference. And we saw that in the Rodney King case, where I was involved, where the officers were acquitted under the state law, but they were ultimately convicted in the criminal state under federal law. So it is our hope that that happens, but the investigation is ongoing, and we haven't heard anything from it.
What is your legal strategy to win this case?
Well, presently we have this case in federal court. It is my feeling that we're going to be able to show that the initial stop and ultimate detention of Oscar and the other men was unlawful. We're going to show that the use of force against all of them was excessive and violation of the Fourth Amendment. And of course, we're going to show that the shooting of Oscar Grant by Officer Meserly was wrong, it was excessive, and it was not justified, and we do not accept the weapons confusion. On the other hand, we do have this view, that given what was happening to Oscar at the time, 2 officers were holding him down, that there wasn't, and he was unarmed, and he wasn't resisting, that he should not have even had a taser employed against him in the first place. So number one, it was wrong to use a firearm, but then secondly, it was equally have been wrong to use a taser. So our view is none of those kind of force options should have been used against him in this case. And then ultimately the arrest of the other boys should not have occurred.
Now there are a number of lawsuits in this whole case. Number one, you settled one of the cases on behalf of his daughter, correct? But there are other ones on behalf of the family, correct?
We have a lawsuit. We settled a case against for the daughter for $1.5 million. We now have a lawsuit involving the mother and the estate. Oscar Grant's mother, Wanda Johnson, and the estate. And the estate for Oscar is that the suffering that he had to endure, one from getting beat up, and then secondly from being shot, and the length of time between getting shot and his death. So that's another cause. And then the mother has a cause of action for the loss of the relationship. She was very, very close to her son. Everyone knows this. She was a person who basically was a single parent with Oscar and took care of him and her daughter. And so that's a cause of action. Then we also have another lawsuit that's outstanding here, and that involves the other 5 boys who were on the platform who were all arrested afterwards. No basis whatsoever to justify this arrest. And so we have a cause of action for them.
I understand that there were a number of witnesses that came forward and said that Oscar said, "I quit, I surrender," to the policeman.
Well, there's conflicting evidence around the lines, but one thing is pretty clear, that at the time he was shot and before he was taken down, he was not being resisting. And in point of fact, one of the officers used a racial slur, referred to him as a bitch-ass nigger. He said that a couple of times. And Oscar, at the time he was taken down, had put his hands up. He was on his knees, surrendering. The Measurely then goes and grabs him and throws him down. There was no basis and no need to do that. And that's where this whole thing escalated to the point where just proper police procedures, if exercised properly, would not have caused this to occur. But you had an over-aggressive officer, number one with Officer Peroni, and then you had this other officer, Measurely, who seemed not to be emotionally capable of de-escalating the situation, escalated to the point where he ultimately pulls out a gun and kills this kid. This kid should not be dead.
Police brutality is a major problem in the United States today. I want to ask you a few questions about that in general. Is police brutality a real serious problem?
It's a real serious problem, certainly in the African American community and Hispanic communities. I've been involved in hundreds and hundreds of cases. I may have 50 cases on my thing right now. This past weekend, I've investigated 2 more police shootings, and so it's a real problem for the African American communities in ways that's unimaginable to the vast majority of people.
Do you think, as a result of some of your cases, like the Rodney King case in Los Angeles, commissions set up as oversight to the police, do you think they make permanent and better changes?
Well, having been involved both in the Rodney King case and in the case here in Oakland called the Riders, where significant reforms have been instituted, that's a real tough question, because I'm not satisfied yet that where we're trying to go with it, we have in fact accomplished it, and we've been at it for over 7 years. But I also think that if you have police chief and command people to work at it and committed to it, you can make a difference. It's slow, because at the end of the day, you have to change the culture. It's the officers on the street who are doing the work. They're then supervised by sergeants, who are also supervised by lieutenants. If that level of mid-level supervision isn't for the reforms, it will not get done. And so the sergeants have to buy in, the lieutenant has to buy in, and the captains have to buy in. And if they don't buy in at this higher level, it cannot happen. And many of these people at the sergeant, lieutenant, and captain level are really old school people. And they resent people like myself who can tell them ultimately that what they're doing is wrong, or who call into question what they're doing, and they resent it. And so the challenge is trying to get a police agency to view itself as in an accountability way. And that has been a real challenge for us. We've been involved in this case for many, many years. We still haven't got it done, but we do have a judge and an independent monitor who are at least forcing them to take a look at it.
Yeah.
And if they get in compliance, I think we will have accomplished something of a major level. But it's not easy. LA has certainly been involved with the Warren Commission after Rodney King. Then they had the Rampart scandal, where we've had similar scandals here in Northern California. And you know, the chief is important.
Sure.
And the city council is important. And ultimately the resources are important. But you cannot allow police to believe that there's no accountability here and that they have a free ride. If you do that, then of course you cannot rein them in. I always thought that the payment of money would on a consistent basis, would cause a department to reconsider its approach. That's just not the case.
Really?
Because the money doesn't come out of their department. It comes out of a general fund. The officers themselves are not financially accountable. The department is not financially accountable. They may have a stake in trying to vindicate their interest, because their interest generally is about promoting a self-serving kind of agenda. That's their real agenda. But in terms of getting them to move, the city council and the mayor and agencies have to hold the police chief accountable.
Right.
And if they don't do it, it won't happen.
Yeah, I want to thank you very much for being on this program, because of your dedication, changes are being made. Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.